to this day. Protestant lives from the 1680s to the 1720s allow us to come closer to understanding this shift in the understanding of time. The moderate Protestant sensibility in that generation displayed two contradictory impulses about time. One moved in the direction of censoring and monitoring the usage of time by one's self and others. The other, encouraged ironically by the devout but heretical Isaac Newton and his followers, moved to instantiate time as an absolute, and thus, ironically, propelling the gradual acceptance and domestication of time as a secular universal. Newtonian time, simply duration, is an absolute entity, not relative to the passage of events. It provided the foundation of the modern understanding of temporality. Time in the world becomes the only framework wherein experience unfolds and is remembered. Despite Newton's own belief in the coming millennium and the passage out of human time into Christ's, his principle of absolute time laid the template wherein timepieces could now be read, and life's worldly passage noted and remembered. Gradually, in the 18th century, linear time enabled the secular to grow in importance. Eventually, the sacred became private and internalized, made less visible in time and space. Sacred time and space retreated, or so this narrative goes, decade by decade in the course of the century. Throughout the earlier part of the 18th century, Christian commentators fretted about the irreligious implications of Newtonian time. They said that time, like space, is an idea in the mind, not a real entity with a separate existence. At century's end, Kant said the same thing, but asserted that such ideas were indeed real. The contested but progressive liberation of the secular assumes a uniform, linear progress in the understanding of time that needs to be modified. A better formulation would note that multiple discourses existed by which religious people from the 1670s onward addressed the realm of time. Gradually, in some, if not most minds, the secular crowded out the religious, but this was a much more complicated process than the linear account permits. In the last decades of the 17th century, moderate Protestants on both sides of the Channel and in the American colonies moved away from the rigid doctrine of predestination, from believing that salvation had been predetermined, a doctrine that left the pious either hopeful or deeply pessimistic. Leaving behind a rigid doctrine of predestination meant a new approach to time. This new post-1660 religiosity had to be crafted in direct rejection of Puritan notions of faith as the key to salvation and of predestination, general or specific. The temporal rigor being sought was meant to rival the zeal and rigor associated with the sectarian groups of an earlier age, only without the straitjacket of predestination. The emphasis now centered on living and practicing a religiosity of pious control over time. It would lead to self-disciplining and self-control imposed by habits, customs, and comings and goings in the service of faith. Every action was to be monitored. The self had to be constrained within the parameters set up by worldly time. This was more than simply a resurrection of the Catholic doctrine of salvation through good works, although it may be said to share certain similarities. The late 17th century sensibility of moderate Protestants assuming a monitoring of self and interior disciplining so that good works might be undertaken, without the benefit of sacraments or clergy, or even the assumption that one had been predestined to live an eternal life among the saved. One theme emerges at this point that will repeat itself in subsequent chapters. the elements of the early Enlightenment enjoyed more fertile ground in moderate Protestant rather than Catholic Europe. Indeed, it was Protestant Germans who first brought enlightened ideas into Polish territory. This was especially true in England after the restoration of church and monarchy in 1660 and the defeat of the Puritan revolutionaries of the 1640s and 1650s. The Christian meaning of time remained, but, like predestination, millennial time seemed less and less relevant. Salvation had to be worked out in the here and now.